Does this come off? Good evening. Good evening. And the Tims, thank you, Rosie. And the Tims have set this up brilliantly. So they've provided lots of context of what I want to talk about, which is diversity. And there we are. The main argument really I want to spend the 15 minutes on is why we need a food diversity day. So it's just picking up on what Tim Lang was saying about coming along to talks and engagement, and more of us need to know this story so that we can act on it. And as Rosie mentioned, a lot of my thinking comes from writing a book about lost food diversity, endangered foods, and making the case of why we need to save them. But writing a book is one thing, and I spent the last year or so doing talks or being on panel discussions, Zoom conversations about the ideas in the book and food diversity. And the conversation always ends with, well, what can we do? You know, how will things change? How can things change? And so I wanted to find ways in which the ideas and the arguments in the book could be turned into action. And so this is why I want to explain a Food Diversity Day is part of the solution. Let me just give you some insight into what I'm getting across in the book. So the book covers, well, it uses as a resource a catalogue that was created in the 1990s by the slow food movement called the Ark of Taste, the Noah's Ark of Taste. So it's a list, a catalogue, lots of information, stories from 150 countries, more than 5,000 foods that people in communities around the world believe are endangered. And so I've taken a small selection of the 5,000, joined them together to tell a story of us, our relationship with food, with nature, with farming, and explained how diversity threads through the human story for millennia, if not millions of years of evolution. Tim Spector and I traveled to Tanzania a few years ago to spend some time with the Hadza hunter-gatherers. There we encountered thoroughly modern humans who were opting to live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Just 200 left practicing no form of agriculture. They're not a proxy for prehistoric humans, but what they do show us is the importance of food diversity in their lives, and they have a potential menu of 800 different plant and animal species. And that is the story that, as I mentioned, threads through millennia. We get to 10, 12,000 years ago, so the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, you could argue, is the most successful human lifestyle to date. But 10, 12,000 years ago, some of those hunter-gatherers in the Fertile Crescent around southeastern Turkey, Syria, Iran, Iraq, began to more intensely select from the wild grasses they were already using as foods, and they ended up domesticating wheat, for example, and settling and becoming slowly, over thousands of years, the first farmers. And the crops that they domesticated, so-called Neolithic package, which includes wheat, barley, chickpeas, lentils, vetches, so leguminous plants. They spread out as these hunter-gatherers, now farmers, spread. And as they spread out of the Fertile Crescent into different parts of the world, they take the seeds and the plants with them, and those plants adapt to different environmental conditions, but also different cultural preferences as well. So we end up with huge amounts of diversity, which is stored away now. It's no longer really in farmers' fields, but it's stored away in seed banks. Here's the Svalbard Seed Vault in the Arctic Circle, the so-called Doomsday Vault, the backup for all the seed banks around the world. And so if you think that a British farmer will be given a choice by law of around 10 types of modern wheats, which are all pretty much genetically uniform. So 10 genetically uniform wheat they can choose from the so-called recommended list. Inside Svalbard, they've collected varieties of wheat, stored them away, and there are more than 200,000 accessions. There's that much diversity in wheat that's been narrowed down. And actually, it's the same with all the other main crops as well. So although there are 6,000, I'm just trying to go back actually, although there are 6,000 edible plants around the world, we narrowed it down to 9 major commodities, of which 3, rice, wheat, and maize, provide more than half the world's calories. And as I mentioned, those are extremely genetically uniform now because of projects to drive more science technology, as Tim Lang was mentioning. I guess that from the Victorian mid-19th century industrial revolution, new science technology, we could override nature more and more, creating greater and greater amounts of uniformity, and then processing those foods to create a superficial kind of diversity. And yes, we do have more diversity in our diets and choices if we belong to a certain portion of the population, but it's the same kind of diversity that's spreading around the world as well. So the book is documenting the disappearing diversity and answering the crucial question, why should we care? We should care because monocultures provide risks. There's no such thing as a monoculture in nature. And so what you find is that the globally traded banana cultivar, the Cavendish, for example, is just one of 1,500 different varieties, types of banana. We extracted it from the evolutionary process of a battle between fungi, for example, and a fruit, which means that it has become vulnerable to plant diseases. And now, and this might be a story you've actually heard of, the Cavendish banana in many, many different parts of the world is now vulnerable to a disease called Panama disease, or TR4. So we've reduced diversity and we've created fragility, and this highly efficient system of growing and moving commodities around the world is just a tiny, tiny blip in human history. So, it hasn't stood the test of time, and it's actually already creating a vulnerable, fragile food system. And it's not just bananas. Bananas are the ones that people tend to see articles about. Next slide, please, because I think wheat, rice. If you look at the major commodities, farmers are now struggling because of the uniformity that's been created and the vulnerability to world crops. So, for example, there's a wheat disease, Fusarium head blight, which costs billions and billions of pounds globally around the world. And as climate changes, that risk increases as well. So the argument is that diversity gives us resilience, and actually crop scientists are now going back through the evolutionary history of wheat and rice and maize and all these other crops, bringing diversity back in to create greater resilience. And with the uniformity, we've also had concentration, the global concentration of power within the food system as well. So the source of much of the world's, one of the building blocks of the global food system, seeds, now mostly in the control of just 4 corporations. Half the world's cheeses are produced with the bacteria or enzymes from one laboratory on the outskirts of Copenhagen. Global livestock production, genetically uniform. So for example, poultry, 3 main genetic lines owned by 2 corporations. However, the stories in the book are mostly positive because they only can be told as stories because somebody out there is trying to save these foods. One of them is just one example. That so-called Neolithic package I mentioned from the Fertile Crescent 10,000, 12,000 years ago brought lentils into Europe eventually, and lentils, one of the most humble of ingredients, actually underpins so many food and farming systems in Europe that have now disappeared as we consume more and more meat. In southern Germany, in a rocky part of Europe, in Swabia, they had a very particular type of lentil, which was part of a farming system. Also, they created delicious dishes, and for centuries and centuries, they prized this lentil. But in the 1960s, as Germany was industrializing, as Canada had a policy to become the world's biggest lentil producer, their lentil went extinct. And one farmer in the region really cared about this deeply and believed that something that was important to a farming system, but also a way of life, to a food culture, had been lost. And it was his inheritance. He wanted to bring it back. So he contacted hundreds of different sources and seed banks. Nobody had heard of this lentil. And he decided he would travel to Russia, to the world's first seed bank, to see if they had this missing lentil, the seed, so that he could bring it back and grow it again. And they said they hadn't. But he went there with a group of 5 farmers, and they actually had collected it from Swabia in the 1930s, but it had been labeled wrongly. And so there's this amazing, beautiful, I think, photo of the man being reunited with his lentil, which is, I think that's such a powerful image of somebody who'd spent decades to try and bring back a food that had gone extinct. And as you see it, it's a story of food security because it's part of a crop rotation system in Germany. It's also part of his identity. Just move on, please. And the story doesn't stop there because his story inspired people all over Europe to go back into the history books to figure out what we were eating centuries ago. Turns out fava beans were being grown in Britain in the Iron Ages. Hodmedod's is one company bringing those back and resurrecting not only lost crop genetics, but also a lost food culture, which probably ties in really well with the arguments that both Tims were making about our future diets, that we can change the world in a positive way by changing our diets. And it's happening. On a small scale, it's happening, but it can be done. Next slide, please. So I give talks and people say, well, what can I do? What can we do? And I got frustrated saying, well, it's all about global subsidies, or cities can do things through public procurement. We can use apps on our phone to connect with farmers or food producers and become, in the words of slow food, co-producers. Okay, I mean, that's fine. But I wanted something that was a bit more grassroots and would engage people. So I invented something called Food Diversity Day, which happened last Friday. I don't know, did anyone join Food Diversity Day? Oh, there's some hands. Wonderful. Good. This was a day in which we had 10 sessions online, all free to access. Some of the world's, I'd argue, the world's great experts in various fields. Tim Spector was there. Tim Lang is going to be in the next Food Diversity Day in next year. So, for example, we had sessions on why is it that we only really consume in Britain 5 species of fish? And actually, why does that matter to us? Why does that matter to the oceans? Why does that matter to the environment? We had fishermen, we had retailers, we had academics joining that conversation. We had people talking about the last of the cheeses in Britain that one person, one maker was still making. So farmhouse, unpasteurized, Lancashire cheese. So we had this amazing story of why does it matter that there's only one person left making some of Britain's territorial cheeses. And then other conversations in which we had bakers and millers. Next slide, please. And people bringing diversity back into wheat and bread. And we had this fascinating conversation between experts in different drinks, beer writers, wine experts, somebody from Mexico who travels finding rare types of mezcal, for example. Mind-blowing conversations about why diversity matters. And I think these conversations excited a lot of people who might have stumbled in thinking they were interested in the bread conversation, but actually came away thinking that, wow, drinking the right kind of cider or perry can save a landscape and some trees. We had also opportunities to experience food diversity. All of these locations were serving special Food Diversity Day menus, using foods from the Ark of Taste. So you could, and actually some of them are still running, so you can go to the Barbican or the BFI and try some endangered ingredients. And then finally, why does it matter? Well, why does it matter to me? One of the most important things that happened on the day, next slide please, was that this, and I had no idea this was happening, but schools were live streaming Food Diversity Day. Amazing. So this is Queen's College in Taunton, and the kids spent their day watching these stories. So, next slide please. The epilogue of the book is Think Like a Hadza, which is that we can never go back to being hunter-gatherers. We can never have 800 potential plant and animal species in our menus. But at least we can do as the Hadza do, which is to be aware that our food is entirely dependent on the future of nature and the planet. And we need to make that connection and have that connection back. And also, Tim Lang was talking about food traveling around the world, and the idea is that if we think like a Hadza, we can be aware of what's around us, regionally, locally, wherever we are in the world, to understand that we can make a closer connection to the sources of our food. So please look out for the next Food Diversity Day, get involved, watch the sessions, go and try some endangered foods, and I think that way we can start to help change the food system and make a difference to the future of our food and the world. Thank you.